Hi everyone. Um, we have thought about negotiations in some more abstract or conceptual ways when we consider the two-level game that is ongoing, and when we looked at the case of the ivory trade. Um, One thing that comes out of the ivory trade is how complex that case is in terms of who negotiates, who is involved. We see a number of countries, we see international organizations, we see NGOs, we see private citizens, all kinds of groups and interests that are represented there. And in the language of the book, Negotiating a Complex World, we are talking about the players. So if we are thinking so far about the board game and the context and who cares about things that would be negotiated over, now we need to think about who really negotiates or who is involved in the negotiations. Now, I hope that you read chapter 3 or that you are in the process of reading it, and I'm just going to go over some points that I thought were important to highlight. So, when we ask this question of who negotiates in international negotiations or in international relations, first of all, I want you to know that you can very well think about two multinational corporations or a domestic corporation and a multinational corporation negotiating with each other in the business arena. But what we're talking about here is more of international negotiations as they relate to international relations and global governance policies. So we are thinking more about countries. So representatives of two or more countries sit together to the negotiation table to solve a problem. Sometimes this process is a formal process. There is actual negotiation with a schedule, an agenda, and representatives of states, representatives of governments sitting there to discuss the issue. And sometimes we can think about what we call track 2 diplomacy. This is more of an informal process where people who might have been authorized to just kind of test the water, see what the other side is thinking, come up with some ideas, and see how the other side reacts to that. Those could be people in academia, those could be business people, those could be media leaders, and they interact with each other informally, sometimes with representatives of government, but a lot of times they are just maybe friends of the leader or somebody else who was authorized to be there, but not in the capacity of a formal negotiator. One of the greatest example of that was in the Oslo negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the PLO, in 1993. Oslo ended with formal negotiations, but very much started with informal talks in what we call track 2 diplomacy. Now, those can happen one after the other. Sometimes negotiation starts in track 2 and move into formal, and many times they're just happening at the same time. You know, maybe there was a session of formal negotiations, but then at the bar in the evening, some people from each side got together and continued to talk and discuss the issues, maybe even made progress, but it's not formal until they deliver it to the formal track. Who else is negotiating? Sometimes we are seeing epistemic communities. Those are the experts. And the more we have specific issues or specific problems to discuss, the more we need those experts. So for example, if we have a global pandemic, any negotiations or interactions about it will have to include health experts and public health experts and physicians and immunologists, etc., right? And those are part of the epistemic communities. They're not necessarily decision makers, elected officials, or otherwise parts of the government, but their knowledge and expertise is very crucial for the issue that we are talking about. We also know that there are global forums, all kinds of global forums. Again, they can be more or less formal, where you see negotiations, many times multilateral negotiations about a topic that impacts many countries or many nations and communities happening there. Traditionally, when we think about countries that are negotiating with each other, they rely on diplomacy and professional diplomats and the diplomatic relations and ties that we have between countries. Countries have embassies and consulate in each other's territories, and diplomats on different levels, not just the ambassador, but the first secretary, second secretary, the consular service, and all of their support staff are acting constant diplomatic relations between the countries. And we also know that countries tend to, if there is a dispute between countries, before we get to the realm of economic sanctions or even exchanging violence or hostilities of any kind, we usually start by limiting or stopping or blocking the diplomatic relations between the countries. Countries also have representatives in international organizations such as the UN, the IMF, etc. We have ambassadors or permanent representatives in all of those organizations. And again, they keep on doing this ongoing daily communication and diplomatic work through the channel of the organization. Now, diplomatic norms that govern the international system kind of keep relations from breaking every time there is a dispute or a conflict or a problem, because countries and diplomats are regularly speaking to each other. They already have a system of communication and they know who to go with when there is a problem. So this is kind of the daily diplomatic relations lay the groundwork for whenever we do have a problem or a crisis that needs more attention from both countries or more countries. Right? Now, being a diplomat sounds wonderful. For many years, I'll admit, I wanted to be a diplomat. But it's also a risky job where, especially in crisis situation, diplomats tend to become the target of whoever is in conflict with your own country. So we can think about the hostages in Iran in 1978 and 79, or we can think about our diplomatic mission to Benghazi in Libya in 2011, when some of the representatives there were killed. There are a lot of other examples where diplomats, ambassadors, or other representatives of the country were targeted in times of a crisis. Now, when we talk about negotiations between countries, a lot of times the spotlight is on those huge summits where presidents, leaders, prime ministers come together, shake hands, sign those great peace agreement or multilateral treaties, and we tend to kind of zoom in on those summits. But we have to keep in mind that many times those are the closing act of the negotiation that happen on lower levels for usually a much longer time. This is still very important, and sometimes you just need the president to come in and close the deal. You need the prime minister to give the final stamp of legitimacy to any agreement or treaty. Sometimes we do have those great men, people who take it on themselves, and either because of their personality or experience, if you think about President Carter, or because of their status, because of their role, the US president, they can impact negotiations. They can push forward, they can bring, they can use leverages that lower level bureaucrats, lower level diplomats cannot. In fact, some of my published work and article deals exactly about the role of US presidents when they are mediating international disputes from this point of bringing in all the power and respect that come with the position of the US president. But in other times, and especially in a country like the United States, where the president is very busy and has a lot of issues and topics to deal with, we see leaders use personal envoys. And here, the difference between a diplomat, an ambassador, and an envoy is that an envoy reports directly to the head of state, and it's kind of just an extension of the head of state. And so arguably an envoy enjoys at least some of the prestige. If it's an envoy of the US president, they enjoy some of the prestige of the office. This is great because that means that the influence of the leader can be stretched to a number of cases and a number of situations. But at the same time, if you overuse it, you kind of dilute it and you're not keeping it just for those cases where you want that heavy weight of, in the case of the United States, the president to come in. Now, when those great men, when the president or his envoys or other top-level representatives negotiate, they can speed up the process, they can close a deal sometimes, but they also bring in the baggage that come with the personal agenda, maybe because of domestic pressure. This is where level 2 can become very influential, or just because of their personal egos. Thinking about international organizations again, and groups of states when they negotiate, when they interact internationally, sometimes the group has been together or they have a real unified agenda that they can speak as one. If you look at NATO, sometimes when there is a dispute, an international dispute, we don't say that the German representative at NATO said this and that. Instead, we are saying NATO is standing up to China, right? So as a group, it almost becomes as an independent entity, especially in this context of the negotiations that they are engaged in. And other times, we do see the different agencies of an international organizations impacting a negotiation process. So it could be coming from the UN Security Council, and a different or a slightly different opinion can come from the UN General Assembly. So it's not the organization talks as one, but we see the dynamic inside the organization, trying to influence another, trying to influence the negotiation process. Another way to think about it, and I think some of you have alluded to that in the discussion forum about two-level negotiations, is that to see all of those interactions as additional levels of interactions. So aside from the negotiation table, what else is going on? What other actors or players do we have to consider? We see different ways of non-state actors, could be ties of between, say, US states, California, and another foreign country. So California has an office of relations in Mexico. And so there's, aside from US-Mexico relations, we can also talk about California-Mexico relations. Sometimes we can think about organizations that challenge the state, and they are still important to the negotiation process. In the ongoing dispute between Israel and Lebanon, Hezbollah, a group which is defined as a terror organization by many countries, is also a player in that game, because they control, or they exert control over part of Lebanon, where they are basically, or they are the de facto government. They provide services to the people and also the security. And so Israel can negotiate directly with the Lebanese government, but unless Hezbollah agrees to that, nothing will happen, or nothing will change. And we see the need of countries more and more now to negotiate with those terror groups or drug cartels or other transnational actors that are not necessarily benign, but they require attention and they play an important role in cross-border relations that have impact on whatever happens inside the countries. And then finally, we do see in many international negotiations, especially in multilateral agreements and treaties, we see the role of NGOs, the environmental NGOs, human rights NGOs, that play the role of experts collecting information, helping in anything from drafting to campaigning in the different countries to later on implementing the agreement. So that's kind of to answer about who can negotiate when we think about international negotiations. And as you saw, it's a complex system, and we have many players that could be involved. And now we can think a little bit about the dynamics between those players. So first of all, we do have kind of, in the international system, we have accepted norms of behavior. And those are defining, or those are at least part of the rules of the game. For example, sovereignty. All countries and many non-state actors respect or recognize this idea of sovereignty and non-intervention. And that is a key when it comes to negotiating anything from international treaties to border agreements to sharing of natural resources, etc. We also tend to have mutual recognition between the actors, and in general, most countries and most actors in the world, most of the time, try to exist in this peaceful coexistence with the other. Where we see negotiations that are failing very quickly or that end up in actual conflict and violence, this is usually when some of those norms is not being respected or recognized. There is one of the sides doesn't recognize the other, or there is no respect to this idea of peaceful coexistence. Another thing is that we can look at, does the country, and especially, and this is when we talk about a country, but also about an international organization or NGOs, is the country considered to be in good standing? Does it have a good reputation? Is it usually keep its promises? Does it known to be helpful in negotiations and helpful later on in implementing international agreements? The more, when you are negotiating with a country that is considered to be in good standing, you might interact, or you probably will interact differently when you are negotiating with a troublemaker or a rogue state, which is a state that doesn't recognize the rules of the game and try to break away. We also have a number of kind of prestigious clubs, such as the Group of Eight or the Organization of Economically Developed Countries, the OECD, where countries that belong to those organizations, again, commit themselves to another level of respect to each other and to the rights of coexistence, and how much power do we exert on the others. But of course, there are a lot of countries, or most of the countries in the world, that are not members of those clubs, and they have to find their own little alliances or negotiate from a point of less power. Another thing that we always have to think about is, what are the cultural differences? Because when we're talking to representatives of another country, they don't just represent the other country, they represent another culture. And here we're not just talking about logistical obstacles such as language, but we're talking about, how do we approach and understand life more in general? In the Western world, we tend to value compromise, and we tend to follow this idea of reciprocity, that we are going to build relations based on mutual respect with each other and consecutive conciliatory moves, right? But there are other cultures where compromise seems to be as a lose-lose situation, that nobody was happy. That's why we ended up with the compromise. It's not something to be happy about. And so if you are entering a negotiation thinking that you will end at a compromise and be happy, but your counterpart enters the negotiation thinking that compromise, meaning that they lost, as you can probably see, there's a real problem here. It's like you're not talking the same language. And so we need to think about those differences. We need to know those differences. And this is where the expertise of diplomats who have been out there and talked and live in other countries and know the culture better is valuable. And then we can also think about this relationship that we can also think about the relationships as they stem from our identities. Are we negotiating with somebody that we see that they're like us, or are we negotiating with the other? Is it us versus them? If it's us versus them, this could be seen as a competition, sometimes a nasty one. Sometimes we demonize the other side. And if we do end up in that situation, it's really hard to focus on the problem and get to problem solving. Instead, we are engaged in this clash of identities rather than trying to work together to solve a problem. We need to think about the other side and put ourselves in their shoes and see what are their incentives for negotiations. Why did they come to negotiate? If you know a little bit of our history, you know that during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in ongoing negotiations over the most important things, such as nuclear disarmament or weapons control and weapons development, etc. What was the incentive there? Well, the incentive was that we were operating under this doctrine of MAD, mutual assured destruction, very strong high level of deterrence that pushed both sides to negotiate with each other because we didn't want to end up in a situation where we are exchanging hits, which may escalate into a nuclear war, or likely escalate into a nuclear war. So we were talking to them, but not because we liked them, but because we recognized that we have to do that. And like in many other things, if you're successful in negotiating one treaty and one agreement, then success tends to breed success, and you go back and you negotiate again. In the same way, failure teaches you maybe not to try again, and that's a problem. There are also this idea when we think about dynamics of negotiations where there has been a cycle. What if the cycle was negative? What if the countries don't know how to trust each other, or a country and a non-state actor? The book uses the example of the IRA and the Good Friday negotiations. The key point there was that when Tony Blair came to power, he was able to break the cycle. He was able to write a new narrative that then attracted more from the Irish side to the negotiation table. But if we are entrenched in a cycle of hitting each other, in a negative reciprocal cycle, it's really, really hard to break out of it. And so that is another dynamic that we need to think about. And then finally, you can always go, when you are negotiating, rely on your identity as the representative of your community and your country, and ask the people or bring up information about your public opinion and what your constituents are willing to accept or not. Again, utilizing level 2 in putting pressure and creating leverage over the other side. So these were some points about the players, and as we move on, we will consider more of those dynamics in a little bit more detail, and how the stakes, how the importance or the saliency of an issue interacts with this story.